Hey guys, how's it going? My name is Arden, and today we're reviewing Black Stars Above, a book from Vault Comics, a publisher who I have liked before, but have never really talked about on this channel. Um, I enjoy their approach to publishing comics, though, and they've always had a really positive and engaging attitude in terms of their online presence. This story is like I picked up the trade collecting what I assume is the entire run of this series, based on how it goes. I can't really see this series having much like of a continuation beyond this. It's written by Lonnie Nadler, newcomer. Lonnie's written stuff like for the X-Men and a couple other indie titles before. But Jenny Cha is the newcomer artist, and Brad Simpson is the colorist for this book. San Otsmande El Hao is the letterer. This was an interesting book. Um, it starts off well, and the whole thing really just takes place a largely flashing back and forward across the end of the year in I believe 19. It says it explicitly at one point because the dates are useful in kind of gauging when things happen, and that sort of tells you something because information is very selective in this book. There is some where they say the date. I believe it's like 1885 or something. 1887. So largely over November and December of that year. Um, there, it opens on Eulalie Dubois, the daughter of a trader who's just like been living in northern Ontario, which is the province I live in Canada. Uh, and they've just been trapping beavers and other animals for decades and decades, getting by on the land. And a lot of the early book is kind of about their struggles and the economic issues that are happening over time as like the food source declines, but also the larger politics going on with the HBC company and the real history of Canada sort of is going past them, and increasingly these communities are relying on agriculture and stuff like that, while this family is Métis. I don't know how familiar you are with this, but this is all just stuff I learned about in like grade school history because it's all part of Canada's history. But they're uh, people who are like one parent is European and one parent is Native American, and they faced a special level of discrimination and struggle throughout Canada's history, particularly around Manitoba. This story talks a lot about Manitoba, but it's in Northern Ontario, where like kind of they're crossing the border into this land basically. And as Canada is sort of emerging into a nation, uh, this family is struggling to find its place in it. So Ulali, a name I definitely had to look up how to pronounce and still struggled with, uh, travels into town one day to get some supplies or something. Her offerings are meager, and she's lucky to basically get like $2 worth of credit. So it's a big deal when this very mysterious guy with like white flake skin, who's very well dressed, comes up to her and asks her to deliver this package up to this nameless town up north past the woods, which, like, if I understand correctly, is just the woods of Ontario that would just go on for miles and miles and miles, or kilometers, depending on your perspective. Um, and he'll pay her $200 if she does it, giving her a quarter right away and saying like, "Do this, well, and uh, you'll get to pay the rest of the payment on delivery. I'll know if you open the package or fail to deliver it, so make sure you actually do this." Obviously, for that amount of money, she agrees. Meanwhile, she learns that she's like part of some dowry arrangement that her father's put together with some other trading family so that the family probably can survive, to be fair. They don't have a lot of resources or whatever, but Ulali, who's never really left the land around her farm, can't handle that. And that night, she sneaks off to go find this town, and pretty soon she gets lost, and horrible things start happening. Meanwhile, we also are. The first thing we actually see in this book is flashing back into November, where she this other character is this surveyor, and he's traveling through these woods and encounters this horrible lynx that has like this weird black stuff coming out of his eye that's dripping down, and the guy touches it, and that's the last we really see of him. She does eventually find his journal, and it's quite interesting. uh, it's basically about her journey past that, and like I generally do with indie books, but feels especially appropriate for like what is a complete story here, just like Pulp, which we reviewed earlier this week. I uh, I don't think I'll give away much more than that. But the first half of this book really won me over with this unique setting, them getting into the politics and history of this era and part of the world, the special attention to the Métis. It was all quite good. And the creepy stuff was really creepy and did some good horror. Like it really had a good mystery to it where I didn't understand what was going on in a like the sense of these are paranormal events and I can't possibly explain them without having someone tell me what they are. Um, it was working for me in the way that a horror book can work, which is to say, like, I don't know if I could ever really be scared of like a book full of pictures or even just a regular book. It takes more to engage me like that, but horror comics and stories have definitely creeped me out or left me appreciating the design and art of the scare. They can also have good moments of suspense, which this book does pretty well too. Eventually, Ulali comes across this strange cabin, and this is where the story starts to lose me. This is basically like this one guy who's lost his arm and is talking nonsense. There's weird panels with him talking that are flipped because he's lying down, and his perspective relative to Ulali is upside down, which is an interesting choice, but leads to the lack of reality going on in this story. And the dad, and there's a son, I assume, though their relationship is not exactly explicit, but the dad just starts rambling on, and it's kind of what loses me. It's talking about the themes of the book and stuff, but it felt unnecessarily explicit. He eventually strips off his clothes and wanders out of the cabin, and stuff starts to get weird. uh, Ulali eventually escapes, and we never really see that guy again. Then she comes across the journal, and we just get pages and pages of text that basically is just the extent of the journal. It's like 8 or 10 pages long, and while I'm not dead set against that sort of thing. It's where the book started to lose me, especially knowing now that it kind of spells out what happens in the rest of the story. It's a weird choice for any comic to make. I know a lot of people who lean towards more of the art side of comics tend to look very harshly on moments like this because to them it's basically prose, and they question whether it should be a comic to begin with. I think there's an argument to be made there, and just because this is an indie book, just because I happen to like the publisher and like the setting and setup of this story, doesn't mean I should necessarily hold back on what's wrong with it, obviously. And I felt there was a bit of a fault to all of this. But anyway, she reads through this journal. It doesn't bode well for Ulali. And then she like falls through this frozen lake, like falls through ice into a frozen lake. And the book almost wins me back over in a big way because things start to get really strange and surreal. And this is probably its best moment of suspense. And the way she gets out of that situation is like creepy and really weird. And then she eventually, well, okay, I don't want to give away what happens after that, but then the ending of the story happens, and it does that thing. Like, it has some neat moments that get into the history of Canada, which is pretty cool. And by the way, Vault Comics is an American publisher and stuff. I don't really know the nationality of the people writing this book, but they clearly did their homework. And regardless, it's a cool take on Canada's history for sure. But Eulalie basically ends up uh, with an ending I liked, but it's very vague. So if you're expecting an explanation for the black goo or the black stars, because these characters do start to see these strange black voids in the sky, and they're described differently and appear differently across the book, there isn't much of an explanation to it, and it kind of gets into what I was saying about that dude in the cabin. He's just kind of rambling, it's a little pretentious, one might say, and the while it ties okay into the overall themes of this book about like this sort of bygone era, I feel like a lot of this stuff has been done before. It reminds me a lot of not only Pulp, but also Red Dead Redemption 2, where all these Old West stories or stories taking place in that time period, like this book, because it literally takes place in the exact same time period as Pulp and Red Dead's a little later on, but not by much. It's all relatively in the same decade. This time in American and Canadian history is certainly interesting, but when we keep hitting those themes of a bygone era over and over again, even in different contexts, like Pulp is a little more modern, Black Stars Above is more focused on horror, Red Dead is full on Wild West style, but like more realistic. Um, they all have the same theme, and that kind of makes it a little tired to me. And while Jenny Cha does a phenomenal job at creating a lot of really creepy imagery and disturbing scenes, I feel like Nadler's writing sort of undermines it a little bit, and it's a little lacking, I might say. I don't often do this, but when I have a relatively negative opinion of something, especially a more indie book, especially something that's more of an underdog, and when I can sense a lot of quality in it too, I do sometimes check out other reviewers to get a sense of where I stand. And looking over the review landscape of comics, I find myself pretty far in the negative of my final look at this whole thing and my overall picture of it. So much so I might, like, out of the reviews I've seen from critics and readers alike, I'm like at the bottom end of it, which is a shame. But I think horror really needs like a good ending. I don't necessarily feel it needs answers, but I do feel it needs some sort of anchor or rules or something to put context to its scares. I don't agree with everything Red Letter Media says, but Mike has said before that he likes horror with rules. Again, that can vary, and I think rules can be played with in horror movies or don't aren't necessary for every type of horror movie. Uh, but I wish there was a little bit more of a grounded reality or some sort of anchor of some kind to the real world to like kind of put into context some of the stuff we see at the end of this book, because it really kind of left me with a feeling of like, oh, that's it, eh? And I wish there was a little more to this. There's a lot of great potential here, not a lot of follow through. Um, if anything, it kind of falls back on a lot of tropes I've seen in other horror books, and more accurately, like movies and stuff, where some of the stuff we see at the end definitely reminded me of some of the best horror movies I've seen recently. But you can't just keep hitting that kind of tone over and over again. And it also reminds me of some pretty lousy stuff. I don't know. I'm thinking of three titles in particular, and at the risk of some spoilers, so I've said quite a bit about this book at this point. If you want to leave it there, that's fine. I will say, it reminded me a lot of movies like Hereditary, Mother, um, Oh, and there's one other. Now, well, so stuff along those lines. And if you know those movies, that might kind of give it away a little bit, but I don't know how else to do it. So just stuff I've seen a lot in horror before, and it left me a little flat, which is a real damn shame because I really liked the first half of this book and really thought there was a lot of potential, but there really wasn't a lot of follow through. I kept expecting like that guy who sent her on the delivery at the beginning to turn up, or for his initial appearance to be put in some context. And while there's a teeny tiny little element of that, in terms of some other characters that show up later, otherwise we don't get a lot of context. There is a good moment that does signify something. She does at some point see evidence that a lot of people have been sent on this delivery before, but you know that gets into what I was saying before about like I've seen that sort of thing done in horror, but like in the past. What I haven't seen done is like a big concrete story on the Métis that's like rooted in fiction and like has that element of fun to it. That's pretty cool. There's been a lot of stories about and like nonfiction, history like biographies, I guess we'll say, or memoirs about the Métis. I haven't quite read a story like this before though, and I quite liked that aspect of it. I wish I liked the ending more. I wish they didn't do that journal scene at all, given what happens. Like, if you want to read this book, maybe just skip over that and read it after. Honestly, I think I would have liked this book better if I had done that. But how would I have known to do that? It's a shame, and it's interesting how down I am on this book compared to the other reviewers who all recommended it pretty strongly. I don't think I'd recommend this. I didn't get a concrete horror experience out of it, and if you're a big horror fan, you might be disappointed too, or you might not be. uh, it might get into this subjective stuff, and I wonder if there's just something about the type of horror that I like, which means that I didn't quite like this book as much as other people might. If you find horror comics really do appeal to you and you do get scared by them, then this book might really work well for you, because there are certainly some good scares that I can appreciate. I just really felt flat at the end of this book. I was talking to a friend of mine about how excited I was about this book, but I was exactly this far into it. And this is where I kind of, oops, wrong way. This was where I kind of got disappointed, and this is where I really felt strong. That's tough to recommend uh, when I'm reviewing the whole experience. If I had been going by the first two issues, I would have probably strongly recommended it, and then it probably would have, well, my enthusiasm would have dropped off over time. But I am glad I reviewed this book as a trade. I will say that. It was nice to have what felt like a complete experience. I talked about how it's nice to and refreshing to have that sometimes in my review of Pulp. I would say I feel the same way about this book here. But beyond that, I was feeling a little lacking. And it's a real shame. Like I said, it feels a little more disappointing because it's an indie book and because it feels like an underdog that I can't really, in good conscience, recommend it. If it sounds like it'll appeal to you, if you think maybe it'll engage you more, if you don't really care about like answers that much, then you might enjoy this book quite a bit. And to be fair, I wasn't expecting a lot of answers out of this book. Everything's kind of told from the perspective of this young woman who's only lived like in her tiny little corner of the world all her life, really doesn't know that much, and has a very limited perspective on things, which this book fully acknowledges. And the character herself talks about it a lot as she kind of journals her way through this very traumatic journey. I like that aspect of it too, because that basically informs the like spine of this book's narration. But so like it left me assuming that she's not going to be able to fully understand a lot of what she sees, and not expecting a lot of concrete answers. And the last thing I would want is like some guy in a lab coat to show up at the end and explain everything that we had just seen. But I would have liked, like I said, some sort of anchor, some sort of context, maybe some sort of other character that knows a little more and speaks a little more lucidly that gives us a few more hints and a bit of a sense of what's going on in this story. And that probably would have been exactly what brought me over to really and fully endorsing this story. But otherwise, I don't. And I don't think I would recommend it. It's it's just a shame because, like I said, I find I'm a bit of an outlier in that regard. Uh, it's I'm okay with that. I'm confident in my opinion. I've looked over this book and I feel how I feel. There's not much that one can do about it. Like I said, a lot of other people really like this book, including a great deal of professional reviewers. Like they have some great credits from Newsrama, Horror DNA, Act 8. I'd never heard of that one before. But like some pretty big books, and I found even more online of some pretty hefty reviewers that really like this thing. So you might too. Don't get me wrong, and I do want to acknowledge, like obviously every review is subjective, but this really didn't work for me, and hopefully I've been able to convey why, like across this stream. So thanks for watching, guys. We do have one more book from last week's pull that I'm finally getting around to, and we're going to cover it today as I kind of clock out these last few books that I haven't managed to talk about yet. But yes, it's time to talk about the most recent issue of Empire. And oh boy, I have got some opinions on this one. So stay tuned for that, and we'll see you next time here on Comic Island. Thanks for watching, guys, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and keep reading comics.